There was a time in Britain when food was scarce during the war, and even in the post-war era, and during that time, meat and sugar was a rare luxury, while everything else had to be rationed. After World War II, Britain faced years of continued hardship, and that hardship especially translated into the kitchen, where everything was simply about surviving. With ration books still in force, households across the country had to get creative, resourceful, and sometimes a little desperate to get nutrition and something with at least a bit of taste, and that led to a wave of dishes that were simple, filling, and sometimes even bizarre by today's standard. If you're passionate about real history and the everyday lives of people who endured it, don't forget to subscribe for more, as in this video, we'll revisit 20 forgotten dishes from post-war Britain. Meals that kept people going even when everything else was falling apart. So first up we have Woolton pie, and no dish captures the spirit of post-war rationing better than it. The dish was created by the Ministry of Food and named after Lord Woolton, Britain's wartime Minister of Food. This pie was intended to be a hearty, meatless main course that every family could make. It combined whatever vegetables were available, like carrots, turnips, parsnips, and potatoes, along with oats or barley to bulk it up. The top was mashed or sliced potato, not pastry. There was no meat, no dairy, and no real seasoning, just ingenuity. Today, it's remembered more as a wartime curiosity than a recipe anyone still makes, but it once kept millions going. Now, what happens when there's no butter to be found, and even margarines is being rationed strictly? Well, you had to improvise, and that too with beef or pork fat. Dripping on bread became a staple snack or light meal for working-class families in post-war Britain. The fat collected at the bottom of the roasting pan was cooled, spread onto bread that was quite often stale, and sometimes sprinkled with salt or pepper. The richer version included jelly from meat juices. For many, it was a guilty pleasure. For others, the only thing between them and hunger. Today, you'd be hard-pressed to find it in a cafe. But this vanished dish once sat proudly at the center of countless British tables. Despite the name, there was no goose in mock goose, or any meat at all actually. Instead, families would mix lentils or soaked beans with breadcrumbs, chopped onions, herbs, and a splash of fat or gravy if they had it. The mixture was pressed into a loaf tin and baked, often scored to resemble the skin of a roast bird. It was a psychological trick as much as a nutritional one, recreating the look and feel of Sunday dinner during times when poultry was a distant memory. It served a purpose, but once meat returned to tables, mock goose disappeared without a trace from British cuisine. Don't let the name fool you. Savory ducks were neither ducks nor particularly luxurious, much like the mock goose before. Known in many regions as faggots, they were a clever way of using pig offal, which was basically the liver, heart, and sometimes lungs, chopped and mixed with herbs, onions, and breadcrumbs. This mixture was then shaped into balls and wrapped in caul fat, the lacy fat lining of a pig's abdomen, before being baked or stewed in gravy. This was hearty, rustic fare designed to stretch every last usable scrap from a butchered animal. Once considered normal, it's now rarely seen in shops or homes, a relic of thrift that faded with rising prosperity. In a time when wasting food was unthinkable, nothing went to the bin, especially not mashed potatoes. Potato cakes were a way to give leftovers new life. Cold mashed potatoes were mixed with a bit of flour and sometimes lard, then shaped into small patties and fried until golden. They were eaten plain, with beans, or spread with jam for a sweet salty treat. For children, this might even pass as a treat after school. Today, they've been replaced by frozen hash browns and trendy brunch menus. But back then, they were a reliable standby when cupboards were bare and bellies were rumbling. A classic example of making the most out of what you had. Beetroot sandwiches were exactly what they sound like. Sliced, boiled beetroot laid between two pieces of bread, usually spread with margarine if you were lucky. The earthy sweetness of the beetroot offered just enough flavor to feel like something more substantial, and since beetroot was easy to grow at home, it was a garden staple during and after the war. With limited access to meat or cheese, this humble sandwich became a surprisingly popular meal. Today, those looking to go on a diet might fancy this sandwich, but most people who lived at that time only remembered it due to the shortages. In the absence of exotic vegetables and imported goods, swedes and carrots became two of the most commonly available staples in British kitchens. Both root vegetables grew well in UK soil and were featured heavily in ration-friendly cookbooks. Mashed together, sometimes with a touch of salt or a splash of milk, they created a filling and surprisingly sweet side dish. For many, it was a colorful comfort food. For others, a forced part of some meal. Today, you might see them separately at a carvery, but mashed together as a post-war necessity. That's a version most modern diners have never tasted. One of the more unusual dishes of the post-war period was cow's udder. Yes, the actual mammary tissue of the animal, cleaned, boiled, sliced, and sometimes grilled. Because offal wasn't rationed in the same way as prime cuts, families turned to forgotten or avoided parts of animals to feed themselves. Cow's udder, when prepared correctly, had a soft, fatty texture and was occasionally compared to a bland version of tongue or tripe. But the appeal was limited, and for obvious reasons, it's no longer available in most butcher shops, let alone on your plate. A truly forgotten dish of frugal times. Sometimes, food didn't need a fancy name, it just had to fill your stomach. Boiled cabbage and potatoes was one such meal. Because there wasn't much butter or meat to go around the table, vegetables were boiled until soft and served hot with salt, if available. This meal appeared over and over again, especially in colder months when fresh produce was rare and root vegetables were much easier to store. It wasn't glamorous, but at the very least it was reliable. Today, it might sound more like livestock feed than human food, but in post-war Britain, it was nourishment, and for many, that was enough. The national loaf was the only bread available to most households during and after the war. Made with wholemeal flour, often including wheat germ and bran, it was a dense, grayish-brown loaf that the government mandated to conserve white flour for essential uses. Nutritionists touted it as a healthier option, but the public largely hated it. It went stale quickly, crumbled easily, and lacked the soft texture people loved in white bread. Even so, it was everywhere, toasted, fried, or topped with dripping. When white bread returned to shelves, the national loaf disappeared overnight, and almost no one missed it. Named after the noise it makes while frying, bubble and squeak was a classic leftovers dish. The dish has been known since at least the 18th century, and in its early versions it contained cooked beef, but by the mid-20th century, the two vegetables had become the principal ingredients. Traditionally made from leftover cabbage and potatoes, sometimes with bits of carrot or other vegetables, it was mashed together and pan-fried into a crispy, golden cake. In homes where wasting food was unthinkable, this dish became a Monday staple, using up everything from the Sunday roast, if there was one, to weekday odds and ends. Although you might see gourmet versions today, the real wartime bubble and squeak, born out of necessity, is rarely made anymore. Once a mainstay in British hotels, schools, and military kitchens, brown Windsor soup became notorious for its thick, gloopy texture and vague meat flavor. Leftovers would be pureed or mixed into brown mystery soups, whose connection with the original Windsor recipe may have been in name only. Made from cheap cuts of meat, root vegetables, and thickened with flour or corn flour, it was meant to be something filling. During and after the war, it became a staple in institutions feeding the masses. But as soon as food standards rose, it became the butt of jokes, a symbol of the blandness of British cuisine. Today, it's virtually extinct, its name mostly remembered in parodies and historical food blogs. In the days before refrigeration was common, meat didn't always look or smell its best, but families did what they had to survive. Old meat, often grayish or with a slight smell, would be boiled, heavily seasoned, or made into pies and stews to mask its age. Many would soak it in vinegar or salt water before cooking. Today, we'd toss it immediately, but back then, it was a challenge to overcome. The practice faded quickly as food safety and refrigeration became the norm. While it might shock modern sensibilities, horse meat was eaten openly in post-war Britain, especially when other meats were either unaffordable or completely unavailable. Though technically legal, it was still considered taboo by many. But with ration books in hand and empty shelves at the butchers, some families saw no alternative. Horse meat was lean, slightly sweet, and often sold under ambiguous names like cheval or special cut to mask its origins. For most, it was a desperate last resort, and one that quickly disappeared from the public plate as soon as rationing eased. Today, eating horse remains culturally rejected across the UK. When sweets were scarce and childhood cravings persisted, sugar butties stepped in. It was as simple as it sounds. Slices of bread, often spread with a thin layer of margarine or lard, then sprinkled with a precious spoonful of sugar. Sometimes they were served as dessert, other times they were just something to keep the kids quiet. This sugary sandwich became a beloved and a nutritionally questionable treat for post-war children. As food standards changed and sweet options became more available, sugar butties vanished, but for many, they remain a fond, sugary memory of growing up with less. Bread pudding was the dessert of the thrifty. Born from the need to use every last scrap, it started with stale bread soaked in milk or water, mixed with dried fruits, when available, a bit of fat, and sometimes treacle or jam. The mixture was then baked into a dense, chewy slab, warm, filling, and just sweet enough. While bread pudding exists in some modern forms, the wartime version was less about indulgence and more about survival. It was served hot or cold, often in thick slices, and made regularly in homes and school canteens alike. Stuffed pigs or lamb's hearts were surprisingly common in post-war kitchens. Offal was not rationed in the same way as prime cuts as we talked about before, so it was like an affordable source of protein. The hearts were cleaned, packed with a mixture of oats, herbs, onions, and breadcrumbs, then baked or boiled until tender. While the idea might sound unappetizing today, many households treated it as a comforting dish. It was warm, meaty, and hearty in more ways than one. As meat rationing ended and preferences shifted, dishes like this quickly disappeared. Corned beef hash was a staple throughout the post-war years. Tinned corned beef, which was often imported from South America, was chopped and fried with potatoes and onions, and sometimes bulked out with cabbage or leftover vegetables. It was quick, filling, and used ingredients with long shelf lives. The smell of it frying in the pan became a familiar scent in homes across the country. Though tinned corned beef still exists, the wartime-style hash, greasy, hearty, and often eaten straight from the pan, is largely a relic. Today's versions are gourmet by comparison, but back then it was survival on a plate. Brawn, also known as head cheese, was not cheese at all, but a cold, jelly-like meatloaf made from the boiled head of a pig. The flesh, fat, and gelatin were extracted, chopped, and pressed into molds to set into a sliceable cold cut. It was an efficient way to use every part of the animal, especially when nothing could be wasted. Eaten with pickles or bread, brawn was cheap and protein-rich. But it was also divisive, and many were put off by the idea even then. In modern Britain, it's all but disappeared, replaced by less confronting deli options. You might still find porridge in modern homes, but the wartime version was a different beast entirely. Often made with water instead of milk, unsweetened, and occasionally bulked out with breadcrumbs or powdered egg, it was fuel more than food. Porridge was served at breakfast, sometimes for dinner, and filled the belly when little else was available. Sugar was rationed, so sweetening it was rare. Syrup or jam, if used, was a precious luxury. Today's creamy, Instagram-ready porridge bowls are a far cry from the thin, lumpy sustenance that defined the post-war breakfast table. This version, long gone and largely forgotten. And that's it for today's trip down memory lane. Give it a like if it brought back the flavor of the past, and don't forget to subscribe for more delicious nostalgia. See you next time.